Salt Lane, West Kingston, a place where the road is cracked, the walls are stained, and children grow up knowing early that the world does not owe them anything. It is a place that has produced hardship and hustle in equal measure, and it was right there, in the poorest house on that desolate stretch of road, that a boy named Mark Anthony Meary came into the world on July 15th, 1973. He was the youngest of 15 children. His father, Benjamin Meary, was a factory worker. His mother, Marlene, sold in the market and gave her baby a nickname, Buju, a maroon word for breadfruit, given because the child was round and chubby. Nobody standing on Salt Lane that day could have known that this little breadfruit boy would one day break Bob Marley's record, win a Grammy Award, and then lose nearly a decade of his life inside a Georgia prison because of a man he met on a plane. That is the story, and it deserves to be told straight. The Meary family were proud people, even without money. They were descendants of the Maroons, the fierce West African warriors who escaped British slavery and fought their oppressors in the mountains of Jamaica. That bloodline mattered. It shaped how Buju carried himself, how he spoke, and eventually, how he sang. His mother loved music deeply. She would bring the sounds of the dance hall into the home, and young Mark would absorb every lyric, every rhythm, every story. By the time he was 12 years old, he was not just listening. He was performing at local sound systems in Kingston, a shy kid with an oversized voice that sounded like it belonged to a grown man twice his size. In 1986, a school friend introduced him to producer Robert French, and in 1987, at just 14 years old, Mark Meary recorded his first single, titled The Ruler. He had adopted the name Buju Banton by then, Buju from his mother's nickname, and Banton from one of his musical heroes, the DJ Buju Banton. In Jamaican parlance, a Banton is a master storyteller, a title earned through skill and delivery. He was not yet 15, but already the name fit. He took a break to allow his voice to mature, and when he came back, it had dropped into something extraordinary, a thick gravel growl that hit listeners in the chest. He signed with Penthouse Records in 1991 and worked alongside producer Dave Kelly, and what followed was a run nobody had seen in Jamaican music. Hit after hit after hit. By 1992, Buju Banton had broken the record previously held by Bob Marley himself, scoring more #1 singles on the Jamaican charts in a single year than any artist before him. He was 19 years old, but that same year, 1992, something else happened, something that would chase him for the rest of his career, and arguably hand his enemies the ammunition they needed years later when things started going wrong. He recorded Boom Bye Bye. The song was a hardcore dancehall track with lyrics that called for violence against gay men. In dancehall Jamaica, anti-gay sentiment was not unusual. It was embedded in the culture, the politics, even the music of the era. But Boom Bye Bye was different in its directness. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, known as GLAD, launched a campaign against him in the United States. Radio stations began pulling his music. Major record labels grew nervous. The controversy followed him like a shadow. Buju, for his part, refused to apologize. He stood by the lyrics as an expression of his Rastafarian faith. He signed the Reggae Compassionate Act in 2007 alongside other artists like Beanie Man, Sizzla, and Capleton, pledging to respect the rights of all people regardless of sexual orientation. But GLAD and other organizations argued that the actions on stage kept contradicting the paper they signed. In October 2009, just weeks before his arrest, Buju was quoted saying publicly that there was no end to his war on the matter. That quote did not help him when the legal storm came, because here is the thing people miss about Buju Banton's case. The men who wanted him gone were not just gay rights activists. There were forces in the United States legal system, specifically within the Drug Enforcement Administration, who were allegedly watching him. Some close to Buju have said for years that the Boom Bye Bye controversy made him a target, that American authorities had their eye on him and were waiting for a reason. Then in the summer of 2009, they found one, or more accurately, they created one. In the summer of 2009, Buju Banton was coming off a successful European tour. His career had gone through a beautiful transformation by this point. He had moved away from the raw dancehall of his youth and leaned into roots reggae, Rastafarian consciousness, and deeply spiritual music. Albums like Till Shiloh in 1995 and Inner Heights in 1997 had earned him serious critical respect globally. He was no longer just a Jamaican superstar. He was a world music icon. The tour through Europe had been tremendous, and on his way back to the United States, where he was living at the time in a modest duplex in Tamarack, Florida, he boarded a flight from Madrid, Spain to Miami. On that flight, somewhere over the Atlantic, Buju Banton sat down next to a man named Alexander Johnson. Johnson introduced himself as a Colombian transporter, a man who moved large amounts of drugs and money across borders. The two men started talking, drinking, and according to people who know the story, trying to out-impress each other, the way men sometimes do on long flights. Buju allegedly began boasting about his own connections, claiming he knew people who moved money for traffickers between Venezuela and St. Martin and had ties to the drug trade in England. Before the plane landed in Miami, Johnson wrote his number down, and Buju wrote his name, both his real name and his stage name, on a napkin and handed it over. What Buju did not know, what nobody told him until it was too late, was that Alexander Johnson was no Colombian transporter. Johnson was a career criminal who had been working as a paid confidential informant for the DEA, the FBI, and other law enforcement agencies for over 14 years. Court records would later reveal that over that career, Johnson had been paid more than $3.3 million by the government to set people up. He had a long criminal history of his own, was facing serious financial difficulties, and had just found himself a brand new high-profile target. Johnson had been on that Madrid to Miami flight on purpose. He had spotted Buju Banton and maneuvered himself into that seat. His DEA supervisor would later describe the moment Johnson called after the flight to report the contact as a miracle, saying it was a miracle he had held onto the deal. In the week after they arrived back in Florida, Johnson did not wait. He called Buju repeatedly and pushed to meet. They met twice at restaurants in Fort Lauderdale on July 27, 2009, and again on August 4, 2009. Johnson secretly recorded every conversation. Over drinks, the two men talked loosely about all kinds of schemes: selling drugs in Europe, buying cocaine from Colombia, using a boat to transport product. Buju was talking big, the way men do when they are trying to impress someone they have just met. In one recording, Buju was heard saying, "All I do is finance." In another, he said repeatedly, "I stay on the outside." His defense team would later argue these recordings showed a man with his mouth running, not a man planning an actual crime. After those two meetings in late July and early August, the conversations went cold. Johnson kept calling. Buju kept not answering or brushing him off. For 5 months, the deal seemed dead. Johnson's handlers at the DEA were reportedly frustrated, but Johnson did not give up. He changed tactics. He told Buju he had a boat, and he wanted Buju to come see it. Maybe they could relax on the water together. He allegedly suggested the trip could also be a chance to discuss how Johnson might be able to help Buju's music career. That was the hook. Buju agreed to come to Sarasota. On the morning of December 8, 2009, Buju Banton put on his swim trunks, pulled a pair of jeans over them, got into his silver Land Rover with a Jawan vanity plate, and left his home in Tamarack with two people, a female companion, and his longtime friend and driver, Ian Thomas. They drove toward the Gulf Coast. Somewhere along the way, near the exit for Naples, Buju called Johnson to say they were close. Johnson told him plans had changed. Forget the boat pickup spot. Come instead to a restaurant in Sarasota. From there, Johnson said, they would get keys for the boat. Buju agreed and kept driving. At the restaurant in Sarasota, the group had margaritas. Then Johnson led them to what he described as a friend's warehouse. The warehouse was dimly lit. When they walked inside, someone shut and locked the rolling shutter behind them. What Buju Banton and Ian Thomas did not know was that the warehouse was owned by the Sarasota Police Department. It had been fitted with 4 hidden cameras, pointing from every angle, and waiting inside was not a friend with boat keys. It was an undercover police officer posing as a drug supplier with 20 kilograms of cocaine hidden in the back of an SUV. The undercover officer pulled out 1 brick of cocaine and handed it to Ian Thomas, who took it to a nearby table and cut it open. Buju stood beside Thomas for about a full minute while Thomas examined the product. Thomas then handed the knife to Buju, and Buju, in the moment that would be played to a jury and replayed on television screens for years to come, slapped a small amount of the cocaine onto his finger and tasted it. That moment, caught on 4 cameras inside a police warehouse, became the centerpiece of the prosecution's entire case. What happened next is something that even people who believe Buju was guilty have to reckon with. 2 days later, on December 10th, 2009, Ian Thomas and a man from Georgia named James Mack showed up back at that same Sarasota warehouse. They had with them a gun and $135,000 in cash, ready to buy 5 kilograms of cocaine. Police swarmed the warehouse and arrested both men on the spot. Buju Banton was not there. He was at home in Tamarack, on the other side of the state, asleep. Police drove to his home and arrested him there. He was charged with conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute cocaine, possession of a firearm, in furtherance of a drug trafficking offense, even though the firearm belonged to James Mack and not Buju, and other related charges. Buju was 36 years old when they put the handcuffs on him. He had no prior criminal record, not 1 charge, not 1 conviction, nothing. And the man who had set the whole thing in motion, Alexander Johnson, walked away with a commission of $50,000 for his role in the bust. The Jamaican music world was shaken. The news spread across the island overnight. People who had grown up with Buju's music, who had sung his songs at funerals and weddings and church services, could not accept what they were hearing. Back home, the general feeling was that America had gone after one of their own, and many people pointed directly to Boom Bye Bye as the real reason. They argued that Buju had made enemies in powerful places in the United States, and that this cocaine case was their way of finishing him off. Some in Jamaica openly said it was a setup, plain and simple. That sentiment never fully went away. Buju was held in jail in the Tampa area without bail for months. While sitting in a jail cell waiting for trial, he somehow managed to record an album. He called it Before the Dawn. He recorded the 10 songs on the album by calling his producers and engineers in Kingston, Jamaica, over the phone from jail. When the album came out on September 28, 2010, it was praised widely. Deep spiritual, roots reggae music that felt like it was written by a man looking at his own life from the outside and trying to find God in the middle of the storm. One song on the album, called Bondage, contained the words, "I've been accused, wrongly convicted. Jah knows I'm innocent. I've been badly singled out by beloved friends who sold me out." Many people heard that and believed it. His first trial began in September 2010. The jury heard the recordings. They saw the warehouse video. They listened to Alexander Johnson on the stand, explaining how it all went down. Buju's defense attorney, David Marcus, argued hard that the whole case was entrapment, that Johnson had relentlessly pursued a man who kept saying no and only ended up in that warehouse because he was tricked with the promise of a boat trip and talk of helping his music career. The jury could not agree. On September 27, 2010, the judge declared a mistrial. The jury had deadlocked. Buju had survived round one. After the mistrial, a judge granted Buju house arrest in November 2010 and gave him special permission to perform one concert. On January 16, 2011, he took the stage. Buju Banton won the Grammy Award for Best Reggae Album for Before the Dawn. He had been nominated 5 times before and never won. Now sitting in legal limbo, facing potential life in prison, the Recording Academy handed him his first Grammy. The timing was surreal. The very next day, February 14, 2011, his second trial opened at the Sam M. Gibbons Federal Courthouse in Tampa, Florida. During this second trial, Buju took the stand himself. He looked the jury in the eye and admitted that he was ashamed of how much he had talked about drugs with Alexander Johnson. He said the conversations were drunken boasting, that he had been trying to impress a man he thought could help his career, and that he never in any real sense planned to buy or sell cocaine. He said he realized in that Sarasota warehouse that something was not right and that he had broken off contact with Johnson after that day. His defense attorney pointed out that 2 days later, when the actual drug deal went down, Buju was not there. He was home. Ian Thomas and James Mack ran the deal themselves. The gun belonged to Mack. Buju never put $1 into the operation. Not 1 cent came back to him. Fellow musicians Stephen Marley and Gramps Morgan both took the stand to testify on Buju's behalf. The courtroom was packed with supporters who had traveled from Jamaica and across the Caribbean to be there. But the prosecution had the video. They had the audio. They had Buju's own words saying, "All I do is finance." They argued that the tasting of the cocaine in the warehouse showed he was not an innocent bystander, but someone who knew exactly what he was looking at and was evaluating it like a man who had been around drugs before. On February 23, 2011, the jury came back after 11 hours of deliberation over 2 days. Guilty on 3 of the 4 charges: conspiracy to possess cocaine with intent to distribute, possession of a firearm in furtherance of drug trafficking, using communications devices to facilitate drug trafficking. He was acquitted on 1 charge: attempted possession with intent to distribute cocaine. The courtroom erupted. People were crying. Some were screaming. Buju stood there and absorbed it. He had won a Grammy 9 days earlier. Now he was looking at the possibility of life in prison. On June 23, 2011, Buju Banton was sentenced to 10 years and 1 month in federal prison. He was taken to the Federal Correctional Institution in Miami initially, and later transferred to the McRae Correctional Facility, a private federal prison located in McRae, Helena, Georgia, in the rural center of the state. He was there for years. Years inside a facility far from home, far from Jamaica, far from the sound systems and the studios and the people who loved him. Back in Jamaica, people counted down. The Guardian newspaper called Buju's anticipated return the most eagerly awaited arrival on the island since Ethiopia's emperor, Haile Selassie, touched down in April 1966. That is not a small comparison. Haile Selassie is considered a divine figure in Rastafarian belief. For Buju, a devout Rastaman who had built his later career around that very faith, the parallel felt both heavy and meaningful. On December 7, 2018, the Federal Bureau of Prisons updated its inmate locator. Buju Banton had been released from McRae Correctional Facility in Georgia. He had served roughly 7 years of his sentence after the reductions. He was 45 years old. He was processed, deported from the United States, and put on a plane to Jamaica. Video of him boarding that plane circulated immediately across social media. By the time he touched down in Kingston, people were already at his Red Hills Road studio waiting for him. CNN reported that he went directly to the studio. Directly. No press conference. No big speech. He went back to work. The reaction was not without complexity. Jamaica's Minister of National Security, Horace Chang, cautioned the public against giving Buju a hero's welcome, saying plainly he committed a crime. Culture Minister Olivia Babsy Grange found the middle ground that most Jamaicans actually occupied. She said, "There's no getting over the fact that he was convicted. But Buju was loved long before he was convicted, and he will be loved just the same, even if he comes home in handcuffs." International artists also responded. Diddy posted on social media the day Buju was released, writing, "Today is a glorious day. Buju is free. Let's go. King shit. True greatness." On March 16, 2019, Buju Banton stepped onto the stage at Jamaica's National Stadium in Kingston for what he called the Long Walk to Freedom Tour. Over 30,000 people filled the stadium. They came from Jamaica, from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Canada, from the Caribbean, people who had been born after his biggest hits came out. People who had been singing his songs in prison yards and in church services and at family cookouts for 30 years. The energy in that stadium was something people who were there still talk about. It was not just a concert. It was a homecoming on a scale the island rarely sees. In 2020, Buju released Upside Down 2020, his first studio album in a decade, featuring collaborations with John Legend, Pharrell Williams, Stephen Marley, and Stefflon Don. The Jamaican Charities Authority rejected his application to register a foundation in his name because of his prior conviction, a decision he publicly blasted on social media. But even that frustration could not dim what his return had meant to his people. The story of Buju Banton is complicated in a way that most real stories are. On one side, there is video evidence of a Grammy-winning artist inside a police warehouse, tasting cocaine off his finger, talking about financing drug deals on secret recordings made by a man who had been paid $3 million over 14 years to entrap people. On the other side, there is a man who had no criminal record before that plane ride, who was pursued for months by a career DEA snitch who allegedly targeted him, who was not present when the actual drug deal went down, whose co-accused have since been arrested again on fresh charges, and who maintained from day one that he was running his mouth, not running drugs. The truth, as is so often the case, likely lives somewhere in the space between those two versions. But what is certain is this: Mark Anthony Myrie, the boy from Salt Lane who became Buju Banton, the boy who turned 15 children's worth of poverty into a voice that moved the world, paid a price. Whether that price was just or whether it was engineered, he paid it. And then he went straight back to the studio.